Hello everyone and welcome to Blazity video podcasts. We talk about modern technologies and mainly about web apps. I'm Jakub and I'm COO for Blazity Software and I'm joined today by Hugo.
The CEO for Blazity Software, and today we're going to talk about Google Web Vitals.
Hugo, could you kick things off and maybe explain a little bit what Google Web Vitals are in general?
Sure. So Google Web Vitals are an initiative by Google made to standardize the measuring of user experience on the web. And it is an initiative because it is supposed to be evolved over time. The people evolving it are Google. And so far we have 3 key metrics to differentiate what Google Web Vitals are.
Right, but you're saying that it's an initiative and it's something that, because everyone knows about the 3 metrics that
Sure.
Google implements now, but in general, it's more of an ongoing thing, right? And they will expand on that later.
Sure. To maybe provide more context, so far in the web development space, we had a lot of many different metrics to go about. And all these metrics were very hard to explain, very hard to understand for non-technical people, and required a lot of knowledge and a lot of context to measure anything. And so Google decided that it's best to try and find some very representative metrics that are actually representing the user experience and not some lab results. And so they came up with the 3 metrics that we all know today and made them a part of the Google Web Vitals initiative.
Okay, so is it about making user statistics, like UX statistics and web statistics, more accessible to business owners and non-technical people? Is it like the main goal of the Google Web Vitals initiative?
I'm not sure if it's the main goal. It's certainly one of them, as far as I know. I think the main goal is to have the metrics that are actually representative of the user experience. Right. So the ones that you can tell for sure that if you lack in any of those metrics, your users suffer in some kind of way.
Okay, so making sure that we really measure the right things rather than have a ton of indicators that we are maybe not exactly sure what they mean if we're non-technical.
Exactly. Maybe not even that, but with the current metrics and all the technical details, if your website, for example, loads pretty, or rather is not very responsive, you don't really know which metric to blame, because all your metrics can kind of be on a good side, but your site can still perform poorly. Right. And it's very hard to determine which part of the site is really
I understand.
Poorly.
I think I know what you're talking about, because I have seen so many sites that have very good lighthouse scores, but they're still terrible websites, and you don't want to use them. But the score would say that everything is all right. So
exactly. So that's the main point about Web Vitals. That so far the actual experience of the user was really hard to measure.
Right. Okay, so maybe let's dig into those 3 metrics that we have today, and maybe let's talk more about these. Mm-hmm. So could you tell us what are the 3 currently in use?
So the 3 metrics currently in use determine how fast the website loads, how responsive it is to interact with, and how stable it is visually.
Right.
So those would be...
visually stable? Could you elaborate on that maybe?
Maybe let's go about them one by one,
okay.
starting from the LCP. So that would be the loading of the website. LCP stands for largest contentful paint, and it's, I think, one of the more important ones, because this is the metric that has received the most attention, I think, for the past years, because we have so many other metrics trying to actually describe what the largest contentful paint does now. So we have speed index, we have time to first byte, we have first contentful paint, we have first meaningful paint. We have a lot of them.
And they're all currently used as ways to determine if the website is loading fast?
Yes, they're all currently used, and they're still useful because you can usually, many times you can spot mistakes in things that you do in serving your content, your websites. But as we previously mentioned, they are not very representative of what users feel when they interact with the site and how fast they perceive your website to be.
Right. So largest contentful paint.
Yes.
That's the metric.
Yes.
That's the main one that we're going to focus on.
This is the one we have to focus about now, and not forget about the other ones, but mainly focus on this one.
All right. So could you explain what it is, how it's measured?
Sure. So the largest contentful paint means the largest portion of your website. So usually when you open a website, one of the key elements that you see and takes up the most of your screen is either an image or a video or some block of text. And so the largest contentful paint determines what the largest part of your website is.
But the whole website or just the...
everything that's visible when you first enter the page.
Okay.
So if your website is very, very long, but it's only visible partially at the top, that's how your website usually work. It will only measure the things that you see right off the bat.
Okay, so is it a metric that would tell us how fast we can feel that the website is loaded, that we have stuff to do on it, or is it a metric that?
Yeah, so it's a metric that is supposed to represent how fast do you perceive the website to load. So if the largest part of the website is loaded, you generally feel like the website has already loaded and is there. And you don't usually pay attention to things like for instance, a notification icon might appear like 5 seconds after you actually loaded the site, but you don't really care about it that much because you already saw the content.
So what we're talking about here is mostly about how users perceive our website, and that's what we were trying to measure here.
Yes. Everything is centered around how users perceive it. And everything is centered around how users feel about it. And this is also, we haven't mentioned this yet, but this is also a big part of the whole Web Vitals initiative, that most of the measurements that Google does and how your actual Web Vitals are measured are taken from users directly. So they are not lab measurements, they're not page speed measurements, they're not lighthouse measurements, but they are the measurements for the actual people. So if we have the largest contentful paint, for instance, a good indicator of your site performing well is that the actual metric is below 2 seconds. So what that means is that your largest part of your website should appear to the user in full below 2 seconds.
That sounds or seems like quite a lot of time, right? Because we're all about instantaneous experiences now. Like everything has to be super fast, super instant, or users get bored. But this threshold of 2 seconds, I understand that's basically how the users will feel that. The threshold below which users will feel that the website is still fast.
Yes, because we're talking not about the whole website loading, but we're still talking about the largest contentful paint, like the largest part of your website being visible to the user. Because over the years, we've talked about the websites having to load in X amount of seconds. Otherwise, we have increase of the bounce rate and so on and so on. But we haven't actually really ever specified what the loading speed is and which metric we're considering. And here we're considering the largest contentful paint, the largest part of your website within 2 seconds, and that's a good metric. If you are within these 2 seconds, it's okay. And just to add, the 2 seconds that we measure is not measured by a tool like Lighthouse or PageSpeed. It's the actual time for your users. So this is a very important part, because if your users are majority are mobile users that have poor internet connection, your LCP, so the largest contentful paint, might be completely different than if your users all have high bandwidth connections and are desktop users.
Okay, so now we're not simulating it. Actually, Google takes a look at how long it loaded for people visiting the website.
For majority of your users, yes.
Okay. So we're talking about real users here.
Yes.
Okay.
And so basically, if you want your website to flash green on the largest contentful paint, it has to load the largest part of your website within 2 seconds on at least 75% of your user devices.
Okay, so that's very interesting. We're finally measuring how people interact rather than how bots interact with our websites. That sounds like a move in the right direction.
Yeah, and that's not to say that the tools like Google PageSpeed or Lighthouse are not useful, because they still give you a good idea and can simulate speed of certain connections or speed of certain devices. But you have to keep in mind that what actually matters is what your users perceive.
Okay, perfect. So let's move maybe to the second one of these metrics, which is first input delay, right?
Yes, it's FIP, and it's not that big of a deal. I mean, it is a big deal in terms of it being green, but it usually is. It's how fast it takes for you to interact with an input or press a button, type some text inside a search box, and it's the delay between you doing that and the website responding. And
that sounds straightforward enough.
It sounds pretty straightforward because it's usually not a big issue. It usually becomes.
Do you mean that most websites already are within the criteria to have their
I would say so.
Delay?
I would say so because usually if FID is bad, it's usually an indication that many things before have gone very, very badly, right, and that we're using a lot of resources already on some background things. That's mostly when it happens, and so the inputs are not very responsive.
So this metric would probably be red or like out of the threshold when you click
a button.
Yeah.
When you get visual feedback that you have actually clicked the button. When the website acknowledges that you clicked the button and that you see that, okay, the website acknowledged that I clicked the button and is now doing something about it.
Right. Yeah. So that's not something that we would encounter often on modern websites. I think that usually when you click on a button, it happens instantly.
Yeah. So it's a very important metric, but it's also really hard to have only this metric in the red.
Okay, I understand.
If it's in the red, it's usually an indication that many other things are in the red as well.
Right. So if first input delay is bad, probably the rest of your website is bad as well.
Yes.
Okay. And the third one, you said about cumulative layout shift.
That's how it's called, yeah. But yeah, this is basically what measures visual stability.
Oh yeah, that's what you said.
Yeah, and visual stability in this case is for you to imagine would probably be like every time you enter the website and had a button being moved over to the top or to the bottom suddenly because an ad loaded, for example, or a font was loaded a couple of seconds after you've entered the site. So basically, all the jumps of content of the page is what consists of the cumulative layout shift. And it's measured actually by the formula is, as far as I know, how much of the site moves by how much.
Okay.
And the good benchmark here is to have a 0.1.
Right, but it's not going to tell us a lot. Like I don't know.
I mean,
in my mind, it doesn't make much sense.
Yeah, but you can kind of imagine it, because 0.1 in this case would mean. So the 0.1 is a good metric. Like if you have 0.1, it's like the borderline of your site being on a good side, and 0.1 would mean that, for instance, that the entirety of the visible content on your site is moved by 10%.
Okay.
That would be 0.1. So if your entire screen would just jump by your entire screen, that would be a 1.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that's simple enough. Yeah. So small layout shifts are acceptable.
If they're very tiny, if you're loading a special font for your button and it makes the button move over a couple of pixels to the left or to the right, it's usually not a problem. But you also have to remember that it's a cumulative layout shift, so it will measure all the layout shifts that happen. So have to think about how many of those would happen. So if you have multiple buttons on a single site, and all of them are making very little movements, they might add up to being
a lot of cumulative layout shift. Yeah. So would you say it's going to be a problem for modern websites? Is it happening a lot?
I think it actually is, and I think the biggest problem here are usually ads and how they are implemented, because they're usually the technology that's most aggressively put into content, and that's the most experimented with to accelerate basically all the ad metrics. And so I think that in this regard, definitely it will be much trickier for people to actually place ads, and you'll have to pay much more attention to it.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine that. I mean, in my head, when I see all those ads loading up, and then the article, for example, becomes split up into two parts and everything moves apart. Yeah, that makes sense. So how would we combat the layout shift with all these ads? Is it something that we address through technology? How do we deal with it?
Sure. So we will address it just like any other problem, basically. We would identify the issue, which is now much easier to identify, having these metrics from Google Web Vitals, and can be identified by more people because of how accessible they are and how easy they are to measure. And then we could go into details, see what happens with all the web APIs, with all the tools like Google Search Console, like Google PageSpeed, like Lighthouse tools. We have lots and lots of tooling in the web ecosystem. All the browsers evolved very, very much into the performance measurement and optimization space. So it's much easier to do. And
right, but these metrics are now more available to non-technical people. Do you think it's going to also be easier for them to fix it by themselves, or is it actually that they can see that there is something wrong and they will have to hire someone to do it for them?
I think it will be much easier for them to see that something is wrong, and more importantly, what's wrong, because usually what people see right now are high bounce rates. They have bad experience on the site, but they can't quite catch what's wrong. So these will definitely help with identifying those. In terms of whether it will be easier for them to fix, it's really hard to say. I would say that for non-technical people, some issues will probably be impossible to fix. It also depends a lot on what you're using for your site, whether that's hosted service or something like Squarespace or some site generator where everything is predefined and you don't really have control over many things.
Right. But in general, they will definitely be able to see them coming. They will see that their website has some bad metrics, and that they should address it, right?
Yes. It's very easy to measure, and it's very easy to tell whether any of them is in red and your users are having a bad experience. Because before, when you had Lighthouse or PageSpeed metrics, even if you had like above 90 score of something, your website could still be bad. Yeah, in terms of loading definitely. And in terms of user experience. And also if your website was below even like 40 or 30, it could still be good user experience.
Or good enough at least.
Yes. Yeah. So it was an indication usually, because if you as a web expert would want to audit a site or see what's wrong, you would probably start with one of these tools and see what scores are and what the suggestions are, because they're very good pointers. But that's what they are. They're pointers. They're not really a clear indicator that that's wrong, you have to fix it. They're more of a, hey, take a look at this. Maybe that's the reason that your website is not performing very well. And with the Web Vitals, we have a clear indication that this is in the red. You have to address it. This is what's wrong. This is how you can fix it.
Okay, so it's very clear. So we have three main metrics. We have largest contentful paint, telling us how fast our website is loading, how fast users perceive it.
Yes.
And then we have first input delay, which we probably shouldn't have in red, because if we have it in red, then probably our site is already experiencing a lot of problems.
Yeah, that's usually an indication that a lot of things are happening in the background.
Yeah. And the last one, cumulative layout shift, is the metric that tells us if our elements on the website are moving and by how much. And moving, they shouldn't be moving when they shouldn't be moving. Right?
Yeah, basically whether your website is stable or not visually. The key thing to remember here is that all the metrics are based on the actual perceived performance. They're not indicating like real numbers. I mean, they are in a sense, but if you have poor largest contentful paint, it means that it's poor for your users and not just poor in terms of numbers, some arbitrary
numbers. So it's not just that Google is saying that it's poor, but your users are actually having a poor experience.
Yes, it's much more real metric than we had before.
Okay. And so where are we on like Web Vitals roadmap? Are they already being implemented? Are they going to be implemented? Is it going to affect SEO and how Google ranks pages?
So SEO will be impacted by it by a lot, because Google announced that since May this year, so May 2021, they'll take them into consideration very, I wouldn't say aggressively, but they'll just take a very, very good look at the sites and at their Web Vitals. And
right, because Web Vitals are something that you can already see today, right? You can check it today on your website.
Yes. You can already measure them. You can already address them. There is a huge increase already in the usage of all the performance optimization and measurement tools that Google said that they observed. Probably because of their announcement that in May they'll take this into heavy consideration when ranking pages.
Okay, so basically, if you have a website, you probably should start looking into it right now. If Google ranking means a lot to you.
You definitely want to have all three of them in green if you don't want to have a surprise drop in your search results.
Yeah, okay. So it's definitely something to look at.
Just to add to it, since it's evolving and it's not, we don't have a guarantee that only these three metrics will stay and be the only part of the Web Vitals initiative. You probably also want to keep yourself updated on Web Vitals, because if the new metric is added and your site is not in the green there as well, it might end pretty badly.
Right, so it's definitely something to keep track of. And just from your personal experience, like, where do you see Google Web Vitals going? Do you think they're going to just stay at these three metrics that we have, or did they already say that it's definitely going to be more metrics? How is this going to evolve?
I think it's definitely going to be more precise as time goes on and we have more user data, like in actual data. So that's definitely something that's going to affect it. And I would not be surprised if we have more metrics. And I would also not be surprised if the three metrics that we talked about will be expanded upon. Maybe changed, but as I said, I think the biggest thing here is the data that we'll get from the actual users. So it's very hard to make predictions because usually the data that we get from the actual users is something much different than we thought and we anticipated.
Okay. I think that's a very good Google Web Vitals summary. Thanks a lot for the talk.
Yeah, thanks, Hugo.